So I had to do a little exercise in what we call historiography, the study of why history is being written, who is writing it, what are they writing it, how does one explain what they are writing. This is one of the most exciting aspects of the study of history, and I'm sorry that we in this country don't give it more emphasis, which we should be doing, which we did in the CHS, but it's rare to find historiography properly taught in other places. So what was the tradition? The question that's always asked, what did the pre-modern Indians have as history? Okay, they had things like myths, the mythology of the Purans, they had the epics, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, and the basic questions that kept coming up amongst historians was, to what degree are these histories in the sense in which we understand history? Or are they, very interestingly, representations of the past? And the present-day historian then studies them as the representations of the past, which makes them extremely interesting, but doesn't necessarily imply that you have to have the skeleton of chronology, you have to have an understanding of events and what happened. That came much later. So what do we have in our tradition? Apart from the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, we do have a lot of narratives, regional narratives, which unfortunately we have not given too much importance to. We focus so much on the important Sanskritic tradition and the later Indian language tradition that we sometimes forget that, even the oral tradition and the study of localization of the main themes is extremely important, and particularly important to the study of history. So, coming on afterwards, we had the Charitas, which were the biographies of kings. We had the Vamshavalis, which were the chronologies of dynasties. And in the later period, we had the Tarikh, which was the biography of the ruler again. So this kind of tend towards writing about more realistically, writing about rulers and events was there in our tradition. The study of these texts was carrying on, was made right up to the 18th century, and then you had the intervention, the massive intervention of colonial thinking. And colonial thinking then brings in a new kind of historiography. Colonial writers went around asking learned scholars in India, what are the texts that are historical? And they quoted the Greek examples and the Chinese examples. And of course the reply was, we don't have texts like that. So the assumption of the colonial writing was, we have to start discovering and writing the history of India from scratch. There's nothing we can take from the Indian tradition. So the earliest colonial history is more invention than actual history. What am I referring to? I'm referring to the basic texts that the colonial writers started with. James Mill, The History of British India. And what was Mill's argument? Mill's argument was that the history of India consists of the history of two nations, the Hindu nation and the Muslim nation. Now remember, at that time, nationalism was alive all over, but this was not a definition of nationalism or nations. Nations are not defined by their religions, they're defined by other features. But anyway, he was insistent that there were these two nations, and his second thesis was that these two nations were constantly aggressive and hostile towards each other. They knew no peace with each other. And consequently, this theory of what came to be called the two-nation theory is enunciated by Mill, is picked up by some historians, becomes a part of the Indian historical tradition for many years until it is challenged and questioned by historians in the early 20th century, and particularly questioned around the 1950s and 60s after 1947. So this was one aspect of colonial thinking, and maybe one of the reasons why it was given a certain amount of authority was because the other interesting aspect of colonial intervention was working on the sources of Indian history, on which very fine work was done. For example, the philological studies of Sanskrit texts, which were being done for the first time, in a way. That was a new feature. And secondly, the study of the sources like deciphering inscriptions. The Brahmi script, which was deciphered in 1837, suddenly opens up a whole new world of source material for the historian, which is the world of the inscriptions. And many of us have argued that the major contribution to Indian history should be a detailed study of history from inscriptions rather than only from texts. Texts are very important, but the inscriptions are equally important for a historical understanding. And this is something which, of course, was done very, very carefully. The decipherment of Brahmi was extremely important. But anyway, returning to historiography, the common understanding was that all Asian societies have a system of what is called Oriental despotism. There is no state. There is only the despotic ruler. There is a peasantry, and there is a bureaucracy that controls the peasantry, collects the taxes, looks after the irrigation system, which is very important. And the wealth is all directed to the despot. Hence this fabulous story of the wealthy Asian rulers, which really was more mystic rather than actual, but nevertheless it was there. All of this, of course, meant, when they said that there's no state and there's no writing and so on, it meant, again, history was denied. The presence of history in the pre-modern Indian past was denied. Now, in addition to James Mill and the two-nation theory, there was Max Muller and a whole range of people from William Jones onwards who were analyzing the texts, the Sanskrit texts, and particularly the Vedic texts, and arguing for what they called the Aryan theory of race, that the Aryans were a superior race, superior to every other in India. The Aryans, the Hindus are in fact descendants of the Aryans. Hinduism is rooted in Aryan religion. So Aryanism became the important feature of this theory and this understanding of pre-modern early Indian history. Now these two theories, the two-nation theory and the theory of the Aryan race, became absolutely foundational to the history that was constructed by colonial writers. And as I said, some of these ideas seeped into Indian historical writing, some were questioned. And slowly and gradually, the questioning got bigger and bigger until, in fact, by the 1950s, both theories were seriously discarded or beginning to be discarded by professional historians. Now, it's important to remember to keep these two theories in mind, because they are constantly brought up again and again in history that we now regard as completely out of date. It has no standing in professional historical writing, but it is there in the public image of the ancient history. What is also important, the question of course is that how did all this come to be challenged? It came to be challenged because there were new ideas, new disciplines coming up. Archaeology was very important. Remember that in the 1920s, when we're still talking about the superiority of the Aryan race, and the Aryan race being the root of Indian civilization, the Indus Valley civilization was discovered. And this was totally different from what was being said in the texts, what was found on the ground. Archaeology advanced, more and more excavations. So every statement one made about pre-modern history, you had to be sure that there was both textual evidence and archaeological evidence. And the two kinds of evidence always had to go together. This was a new entry into the field of history. And it is still a very important entry, which is why today you're having political battles over archaeological excavations. And I don't have to emphasize which battles were. And the other aspect, as I mentioned, was social sciences. Now, in the social sciences, you don't just say history tells us that this happened and this happened and this happened. The social sciences start asking questions about why did this happen? How did this happen? And what was the eventual result of what's happened? So it's a new set of questions. And what I'm arguing is that the questioning of existing history has always to come only by new methods of analysis and new kinds of questions that are to be asked of the sources. You cannot just sit there quietly saying, this is the way it is, but we believe in this and we believe in that and so on the other. You have to have this. And the more new evidence that comes in, the more complicated history becomes. I mean, you take something like the Aryan question today. In the time of Mueller, right up to the time of Mueller, it was, you read the texts, you read them carefully, you were very good Sanskritists, and that was all that was required. Then came archaeology. How do you correlate the texts with the text with the artifact? Very important. After that came linguistics, which is a study not just of language per se, but the function of language, the origin of language, the kinds of influences. And suddenly you get people writing about non-Aryan influences in Vedic Sanskrit. And linguistics takes on a life of its own, because remember that in any language, the moment you have a straightforward language that has an element of another language, you have to ask the question, what was the cultural relationship between the speakers of both languages? So, if you argue and if you agree that there are elements of non-Aryan in Vedic Sanskrit, you have to give some evidence for other speakers speaking other languages that might have had an influence. Now, all of this is really extending the research. And what I'm trying to argue is that as theories change, if the theory is valid and is not just a lot of nonsense, there is an extension of the research, of the ideas. And the good historian keeps up with this extension. At some point, in old age, one says, enough, I can't do anything more, and you leave it to the younger lot. As I keep on saying, it's now up to you guys to do the things. We're all through. But there is that notion, that importance of change and the extension of research. And so, what is it that one looks for when one talks about why and how? Why did an event take place? Did society change? Did caste change? We've all been brought up on the theory that caste, once it was defined as varnashram dharma, nothing changed. I'm sorry, that's not the case. We have a lot of very puzzling evidence which suggests that there were changes. There were new castes coming in, old castes being transferred into new castes, and so on and so forth. How does caste get transferred from one religious group to another? Muslims have castes. Christians have castes. What is this social organization? How did it change? And the social historian today is looking at the changes that occurred through time. Similarly, economy. We didn't have the same economy for 4,000 years, for goodness sake. We had different kinds of economies that interacted. You had pastoral groups, nomadic groups, you had primitive agriculture, you had advanced agriculture, you had urbanization and trade. What are these economic groups doing with each other and how are they relating? And then, very important, religion comes in. Religion is at one level what people believe in and worship, and a whole group forms around the people who believe in the same thing, worship the same thing. But let's not forget, as historians, religion plays a social role as well. Religion is fundamental to many social institutions to this day. You have schools, Shishu mandirs, madrasas, convents. There's religion in it. You have other kinds of institutions which also are religiously inspired. You have religious institutions playing a social role. The temple today is playing a major social role. The mosque, the masjid, also played a social role in a certain kind of society. Churches the world over have played a social role. So it's not as if one is being anti-religion when one says, let's look at the social role. One is simply saying that there is a level at which you have worship and belief. There's another level at which those ideas get converted into social institutions. And as historians, we may be interested in the individual beliefs and things, but our interest shouldn't stop there. We should see religion in the social institutions as well. And that is one of the big changes that has come about in this.